Amen. I've titled this talk, Proving His Worth. This was the highlight of Saul's monarchy. There is no sign in of what is to come and the previous few chapters before. Many of us who know our Bible know that, sadly, he didn't continue in this way. But this is a highlight of what he was able to do, uniting the people. So let's move on. Nabash the Ammonite went up and besieged Jabesh Gilead. And all the men of Jabesh said, "Make a treaty with us, and we will be subject to you." The Ammonites were over on the other side of the Jordan, over in the east side, which I'll come back to in a moment. But Nabash, they're so important to us, aren't they? And we don't like our eyes being touched. But to actually have them gouged out, it's almost Shakespearean, this, isn't it? But throughout history, we have in Judges we have Samson. His eyes were gouged, burnt out, and so we got various sort of illustrations through history of this happening in this grotesque and awful form. And this is what the Ammonites. And one of the things it says, one of you, so bring disgrace on all Israel. He was purposely wanting to do this, Nahash, to bring disgrace on Israel. Not only was he going to bring disgrace upon Israel, we'll come back to that in a moment. The elders of Jabesh said, "Give us 7 days so that we can send messengers throughout Israel. If no one comes to rescue us, we will surrender to you." They're asking for a bit of time. The Apostle Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 4:8, "We are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed and not in despair." Why have I mentioned that? I mentioned that because the children of Israel must have felt like this. And I'm going to share why. In the northern region, the Arameans to the north, and the Edomites and the Moabites were to the southeast too. Then we had the Ammonites on the east side, and we had the Philistines towards the sea on the west side. So the children of Israel sort of crammed in between these enemies that were around them. So they were crushed in on every side. And this was the sign of fear that was going on with the people. Nahash the Ammonite besieged Jabesh Gilead, and he wants Israel, the Israelites that live there, to serve him. He wanted to make them vassals. He wanted to make them servants. Okay, by doing this arrogant thing, Nahash the Ammonite, "I will make a treaty and so bring disgrace on all Israel." I've highlighted that. And so bring disgrace on Israel. What he was actually doing, yes, he was taking on God's people, but he was taking on God. He was taking on God. Whether he realized that or not, he must have known about the God of Israel. He must have known about their worship. He must have known about their nation. But he was actually taking on God. No enemy is more powerful than Yahweh. If we think we can take on God, then we are really mistaken. If any enemy thinks that they can take on God, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." In the book of Romans we read that. History is littered with arrogant leaders who have been unwilling to negotiate and come to any agreed settlement. Many of these potentates have suffered great loss, not just for themselves, for those that they rule over as well. You think about history. Time doesn't allow us to go back over history and see where the arrogant leaders of history who have been unwilling to be kind or generous or who have been unwilling to negotiate, many of them have come to a fall. Many of them have come to a fall. The surrender seemed inevitable for the people of Jabesh Gibeah. Israel was not as yet fully equipped for war. There was no consolidated army, no credible army as such. There was that group of people that followed Saul after that second acknowledgement that he would be king in the previous chapter. This was a pivotal moment for the children of Israel. This was a pivotal moment. It was an opportunity to unite the nation. And we see that they all wept aloud when they heard this, when the messengers came to Gibeah. They wept aloud. Just then Saul was returning from the fields behind his oxen. What is wrong with everyone? Why are they weeping? Then they repeated to him what the men of Jabesh had said. When Saul heard these words, the Spirit of the Lord came powerful, and he burned with anger. The Spirit of the Lord came down on him, and he burned with anger. This was a righteous anger. Anger that stimulates action. Positive, righteous anger that was driven and has driven many a good cause. It is in your anger, sin not, the scripture says. Jesus, when he went into the temple, he was angry because they had almost desecrating the temple of God. They were doing things that they should not be doing. And so the anger, the righteous anger burned. I'm sure that many of us, when we watch the TV and we see things that are the injustices of the world, whatever, it rolls up within us. There's an anger around in society today which is not quite righteous. We've suffered for a long time with things that we call road rage. And there seems to be now a post-COVID anger, where even the most docile people, the most calm people, are getting really upset because they believe some other people who are not really following the rules and regulations, not wearing a mask or whatever. And there's an anger brewing away. But this here, I'm sure there's some righteous anger in the anger I've just said. But this is a righteous anger because it's stimulated and the Spirit of God comes upon him. And anger can be sometimes a good driving. It can have a positive drive. Anger the other way can be really, really negative, as we know. And we've all suffered from that in our own lives, I'm sure. So we must remember that in our anger we sin not. But it's not wrong to be angry about righteous things. Things that need changing. Things that are against God. Then he cut the oxen and he said that he cut them in half and sent the bits around. This is what will be done to the oxen if everyone does not follow Saul and Samuel. Notice it's Saul and Samuel. What I like here is this kingly figure, this one that's coming forward as the king, but also the godly prophet. So we've got that sense of the nation uniting around a positive leader, but also a godly man. There's some positives going on here. Then the terror of the Lord fell on the people, and they came out together as one. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. They were terrified. Sometimes I think we've lost that awe of God. We've lost that sense of respect. It's wonderful in our relationship with God that we can have a familiarity. We can call him Father, Abba, a very intimate term, but yet we still have to have respect for the sovereign God, to recognize that he is one to be feared. It's not good to fall into the hands of the living God. The community responded to Saul and Samuel, who united the people, the kingly leader and the spiritual leader. There was a unity. And then Samuel mustered the people at Bezek, and the men of Israel numbered 300,000. They managed to bring the two tribal regions together, the north and the south. the tribes of Judah and the tribes of the north, bringing all these tribes together who, under David and I believe also Solomon, if I remember rightly, managed to try and keep these tribal groups together. But eventually they split off, the north and the south. But under these two leaders, the kingly leader and the spiritual leader, they were able to hold them together. And he put them into different groups. This is what he said: say to the men of Jabesh Gilead, by the time the sun is hot tomorrow, you will be rescued. What great hope! You will be rescued. Fantastic. And they were elated. They were elated because the nation was coming to their rescue. The nation was coming to their rescue. The cheers. There have been a number of cities through Europe when they have been rescued from oppression. The people come out on the streets with the flags and the horns of the cars and all the things beeping. They were elated when the war ended in this country. When the war, First and Second World War, there was jubilation in the streets. The next day, Saul separated his men into 3 divisions. He was now bringing the army together. He was trying to pull them together. And there was that group that followed him in the previous chapter, that followed him after he was made initial king. He organized to win. Saul had strategic ability, and he had that core group from chapter 10:26. During the last watch of the night, they broke into the camp of the Ammonites. They took them by surprise. And those who survived were scattered. The people said this: who was it that asked, shall Saul reign over us? Turn these men over to us. But Saul said, no one will put to death, for this day the Lord has rescued Israel. We see a sense of grace and forgiveness here. They had taken a beating, the Ammonites. They had taken on God and God's people. But there was a sense of grace and forgiveness. Then Samuel said to the people, come, let us go to Gilgal, and there we will renew the kingship. So the people went to Gilgal and made Saul king in the presence of the Lord. There they sacrificed fellowship offerings before the Lord, and Saul and all the Israelites held a great celebration. They sacrificed to the Lord. They made Saul king, and there was great celebration amongst the people. He and Samuel had united the people. Gilgal, it had a place of national significance. If you remember, Joshua camped there with the people when they entered the promised land. Here we have a fellowship offering, symbolic thing, unity between the people and God. And during this, they confirmed Saul as king. So, we have his first anointing at Ramah for Saul when Samuel anointed. And then at Mizpah, the people were shown that he was to be king. And at Gilgal, having seen his victory, they confirmed him as king. I want to read something to you that I read earlier on. And this is from Mary J. Evans again. And she is a wonderful writer on Samuel. To seek to lead God's people without their consent and support does not take seriously the fact that they are God's people, themselves in relationship with God. To seek to lead without being called by God is also a denial of the reality of God's relationship with his people. To seek to lead without being called by God is also a denial of the reality of God's relationship to his people. Godly leaders. We had King Saul, who was in a good place at this time, and Samuel, who was the prophet. So what can we learn from this story? What can the scriptures teach us? Well, they were united in one cause. The people came together in one cause. Even the factions can be united with a good leadership. You can have situations, even within churches, where there are different groups within a church, but under good leadership, those people can be held together. And the nation of Israel was held together for a period of time. The north and the south tribes were held together under good and positive leadership. We need to follow God, and we need to follow good leadership. And we all need that in our lives. And this is what we find. And then we also find forgiveness, and we find mercy for our enemies here. And next week, and the week after next, we'll be looking at in the book of Romans.